Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world of marble mansions, diamond tiaras, and reputations so fragile they could shatter over the wrong fork. Welcome to the Gilded Age, where the rich weren't just rich, they were competitively, exhaustingly, ruinously rich, and where one bad dinner party could quietly end your entire bloodline. First, a genuine thank you to the listener who suggested tonight's topic. Your ideas are the reason this little channel keeps growing, and I really do read every single one. If you enjoy what I do here, consider liking and subscribing, but only if you actually mean it. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you, because somehow it's always the exact hour when respectable people are supposed to be asleep. And if you'd rather drift off with your eyes closed, the channel is now on Spotify too. The link is down in the description. And if you'd like a little more, membership is already available on the channel, which gives you access to 8 hours of ad-free video to drift off to, uninterrupted whenever you like. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft hush of white noise, fluff your pillow, and settle in. Let's wonder for a moment. What would it feel like to have more money than a small nation and still lie awake terrified that Mrs. Astor didn't approve of your centerpiece? Could you survive a world where divorce was social suicide, where a single misplaced rumor could vaporize 4 generations of respectability overnight? Would you know which of the 300 forks to reach for, or would you start a scandal simply by laughing too loudly at the opera? Could you keep up appearances while your entire fortune quietly evaporated in a stock panic you never saw coming? And now, congratulations, you've just woken up in 1883. You have a mansion you can't quite afford to heat, a calling card tucked into your glove, and a social ranking that could collapse before breakfast. Sleep well. So here you are, tangled in imported silk sheets, in a bedroom roughly the size of a small church, and the very first thing you feel isn't luxury, it's dread. Welcome to life at the summit of Gilded Age society, where you own a marble palace, a stable of horses, and absolutely no peace of mind whatsoever. Somewhere downstairs a butler is quietly judging your posture. Somewhere across town, a woman named Mrs. Astor is deciding whether your family still counts as people, and you haven't even had your coffee yet. Let's take in the room. The ceilings soar so high you could lose a kite up there. The curtains cost more than a working man earns in a decade, and they're the kind of deep velvet that swallows all light and most joy. There's a fireplace big enough to roast an ox, a chandelier dripping with crystal, and a portrait of some ancestor glowering down at you as if he already knows you're going to embarrass the family name before lunch. It's the 1880s, and you are rich beyond the wildest dreams of nearly every human being alive. You should feel like a king. Instead, you feel like a contestant who's about to be eliminated and hasn't been told the rules. Because here's the cruel joke of your world. The money was the easy part. What matters now is whether you belong, and belonging is a full-time job with no salary, no vacation, and a boss who despises you. Every gesture is a test. The way you hold your fork, the hour you pay a visit, the depth of your bow, the phrasing of a note, all of it is being watched, weighed, and quietly graded by people who would rather die than tell you your score. It's a bit like being dropped into an exam where nobody hands you the questions, but everyone gasps when you get one wrong. You ring for your maid, who arrives to begin the 2-hour process of assembling you into a person. There's the corset, which turns breathing into an optional luxury. There are the many, many layers, each one heavier and more flammable than the last. There's your hair, which will be tortured into a shape that defies gravity, physics, and common sense. By the time you're dressed, You've expended more effort than most people spend building a barn and you still haven't left the room. Congratulations. You're now presentable enough to be terrified in public. Downstairs waits an army of servants who know more about your finances, your marriage, and your secrets than you do. They've seen the unpaid bills. They've heard the arguments through the walls. They know which of your smiles are real and which are performances staged for the neighbours. You employ them, you pay them, and you are utterly at their mercy, because a single loose tongue below stairs could unravel everything above them. Ever tried to relax in a house where 12 people quietly know you're broke? It's not restful, and this is only the morning. Ahead of you stretches a day built entirely of invisible landmines, the visits, the cards, the lunches, the fittings, the endless negotiation of who outranks whom. You will spend it smiling until your face aches and calculating until your head throbs, all to hold a position that could evaporate over one badly chosen centerpiece. You are rich, you are powerful, and you are absolutely petrified. Welcome to the top of the world, where the view is magnificent and nobody can breathe. Let's talk about the guest list that ran a nation. In Gilded Age New York, high society wasn't a feeling. It was a head count, and the magic number was 400. Supposedly because that's how many bodies fit into Caroline Astor's ballroom. If you weren't on the list, you simply did not exist. It was the most exclusive group chat in human history, except getting removed didn't just bruise your feelings. It quietly erased your family's future. And the woman holding the pen almost never smiled. Caroline Astor was, for a stretch of years, the closest thing America had to a queen, which is remarkable for a country that fought a whole war to avoid having one. She didn't rule through law or force or election. She ruled through invitations, and that turned out to be far more powerful. A word from her could lift a family into the heavens or drop it straight through the floorboards. She decided who was old money and who was merely rich, a distinction that mattered more than breathing to the people caught on the wrong side of it. To be at her table was to have arrived. To be left off, it was to be nobody, no matter how many railroads you owned. The number 400 wasn't officially carved in stone anywhere, but everyone behaved as if it were. It represented the notion that true society was small, sealed, and impossibly hard to enter. A velvet rope stretched across the entire upper crust. Below that rope churned thousands of desperate, glittering hopefuls, all clutching their fortunes and praying for a nod. Above it sat the chosen few, guarding their spots with the ferocity of hens defending the last dry patch in a rainstorm. It was less a social scene and more a fortress with a single, very picky gatekeeper. Mrs. Astor didn't do this alone, of course. She had a partner in judgment, a slim, sharp-tongued arbiter of taste named Ward McAllister, who helped her draw up the lists and enforce the rules with the enthusiasm of a man who'd finally found his life's purpose. Together they curated society the way a museum curates paintings, deciding what belonged on the wall and what got shoved into storage. He coined the whole mythology of the 400 and fed it to the newspapers, and the public devoured it. Everyone wanted to know who was in. Almost nobody was. Getting on the list required more than money. Money was assumed, the way water is assumed at a swimming pool. What you needed was lineage, Polish, and the approval of people who'd been rich long enough to forget they hadn't always been. If your fortune was fresh, you were suspect. If it came from something grubby like trade or manufacturing, you were doubly suspect. You could spend decades building your way toward the rope and still be waved off at the last moment by a single cool glance. Ever been left on read by an entire social class? That was your life. And the terror of it all was how quickly you could fall, You didn't get a warning, a hearing, or a second chance. One season your name graced every invitation. The next it simply didn't, and no one would tell you why. The whispers would reach you eventually, if they reach you at all. So you smiled, you flattered, you sent your cards, and you lay awake wondering whether the woman with the ballroom still counted you among the living. In her hands, a guest list became a life sentence. She just happened to write it in beautiful ink. It's time to pay a social visit, and yes, this is somehow life-threatening. In your world, you couldn't simply knock on a door like some common turnip farmer. You carried a calling card, a little rectangle of stiff paper that somehow held the entire weight of your reputation. Fold the wrong corner, leave it on the wrong silver tray, arrive at the wrong hour, and you'd committed a social crime people would whisper about for a decade. It's a bit like sending one text and accidentally ending 3 friendships. The calling card looked innocent enough. Your name printed in tasteful script on a small card, nothing more. But that modest slip of paper operated under a rule book so dense and merciless, it could have been written to torment you personally. There were rules about the size of the card, the font, the thickness of the stock, and whether your name should carry a flourish or stay austere. Too fancy and you looked like you were trying too hard. Too plain and you looked like you didn't understand the game. There was, of course, no correct answer that everyone agreed on, which is precisely how these things stayed cruel. Then came the ritual of delivery, which was where most souls perished. You'd travel to a grand house, and rather than actually seeing the lady of the house, you often just handed your card to a servant at the door. That servant placed it on a silver tray, and the card sat there, silently announcing that you had come, you had done your duty, and you'd been appropriately respectful. Whether the lady chose to receive you in person was entirely up to her mood, your rank, and the alignment of the social stars. You could be turned away with a polite murmur and never know if you'd offended her, or simply caught her on a bad afternoon. The folding was its own dark art. Bend down one corner, and it meant you delivered the card in person. A subtle flex of your own effort and respect. A different fold meant something else entirely. Condolences, congratulations, or a farewell before leaving town. Each crease carried a coded message that everyone was expected to read fluently. Fold it wrong, and you might accidentally offer sympathy for a death that hadn't happened, or announce a departure you weren't taking. Ever congratulated someone on the wrong thing and watched their face freeze? Multiply that by an entire city. Timing mattered just as viciously. There were correct hours to call and disastrous ones. Arrive too early and you were a barbarian. Arrive uninvited at dinner and you were a menace. Fail to return someone's card within a proper window and you delivered a slap without lifting a hand. The whole system ran on a kind of paper diplomacy, where wars were declared and alliances sealed entirely through cardboard, and nobody ever raised their voice. It was passive aggression elevated to a fine art, and you were expected to be a master of it before your morning tea, and the stakes, absurdly, were real. A woman who mishandled her cards could find her invitations quietly drying up. A newcomer who didn't grasp the rules exposed herself as an outsider instantly, and outsiders did not last. Entire relationships lived and died on the correct handling of these tiny rectangles, so you kept a little case of them tucked in your glove, guarded them like sacred relics, and studied the etiquette manuals as if your life depended on it, because in the strange, glittering logic of your world, it more or less did. All that fortune, all those mansions, and your fate hung on a folded corner. Here's a delightful fact about your enormous fortune. To the right people, It's completely worthless. In the Gilded Age, there was money, and then there was old money. Families who'd been wealthy long enough to pretend they'd never once thought about it. If your gold came from railroads, oil, steel, or anything that involved actual effort, the old guard treated you like a well-dressed stranger who'd wandered in from the street. You could build a mansion right next door and still never be invited in for tea. The old families, the ones with Dutch names and centuries-old grudges, had a particular genius for making you feel small while smiling warmly the entire time. They'd inherited their wealth from ancestors who'd made it so long ago that the origins had gone soft and respectable with age. To them, a fortune wasn't something you built. It was something you were born clutching. The very act of having earned your money marked you as a labourer in disguise, no matter how many zeros trailed behind it. It was snobbery so refined it barely made a sound. They called your kind the nouveau riche, which is French for please leave, and they wielded the phrase like a scalpel. New money was loud, they sniffed. New money bought too many diamonds, built houses too large, threw parties too extravagant, and generally behaved like people delighted to be rich, which was apparently the gravest sin of all. Real breeding, they insisted, meant treating your wealth with bored indifference, as if a marble staircase was simply the natural state of things and not something you'd very much wanted. Ever try to look casually unimpressed by your own success? It's harder than it sounds. The cruelty ran deeper than mere sneering. Old money controlled the institutions that mattered, the exclusive clubs, the best pews, the private boxes, the innermost circles where the truly important decisions were whispered. You could accumulate all the wealth on earth and still find every one of those doors mysteriously locked. Membership committees would lose your application. Invitations would fail to arrive. Conversations would politely dissolve the moment you approached. It was a wall you couldn't buy your way through, built specifically to remind you that money and belonging were two entirely different currencies. And so the new money families did the only thing they could. They spent. If they couldn't be accepted, they'd be impossible to ignore. They built bigger, brighter, more dazzling palaces than the old guard had ever dreamed of, each one a shout of frustration rendered in limestone and gold leaf. If subtlety was the language of the elite, the newcomers decided to scream. It's the age-old logic of the excluded. If you won't let me in, I'll build something so magnificent you'll have to stare at it forever. Pettiness, but with architecture. The bitter irony, of course, was that today's old money had once been new money too. Every dignified Dutch family had, generations back, some grubby ancestor who'd hustled and scraped and clawed his way to wealth. They'd simply been rich long enough to forget it, papering over their origins with time and portraits and carefully edited family histories. So the whole hierarchy rested on nothing more than seniority, a question of who'd arrived first and pulled the ladder up behind them. You weren't lesser, you were just later. And in your world, being later meant standing outside in the cold, holding a fortune nobody wanted to see, waiting for a door that might never open. Let's talk about the party that rearranged the entire social order. In 1883, a determined woman named Alva Vanderbilt threw a costume ball so staggeringly expensive it made grown millionaires sweat. The genius cruelty of it. She pointedly refused to invite Mrs. Astor's daughter, forcing the aging queen of society to come calling, card in hand, just to get her own child through the door. It was a power move so ruthless it belongs in a war room, executed entirely with feathers, satin, and spite. Alva Vanderbilt had a problem, and the problem was that she was rich, but not accepted. The Vanderbilt fortune was colossal, one of the largest in the country, but it was new. built on railroads and steamships within living memory. That made Alva, in the eyes of Mrs. Astor and her old money court, a well-funded nobody. For years the Astor set had looked straight through the Vanderbilts as if they were made of glass. Alva, being the sort of woman who treated a closed door as a personal invitation to knock it off its hinges, decided she'd had quite enough of being invisible. So she built a house, not a house really, a chateau, a vast French confection of a mansion on Fifth Avenue so breathtaking that the whole city stopped to gawk. And then she announced she would celebrate it with a costume ball of unprecedented scale, the kind of event people would talk about for the rest of their lives. She spent a sum that could have funded a small town. She imported flowers by the wagon load, hired the finest musicians, and had guests commission elaborate costumes worthy of royalty. Everyone who was anyone wanted an invitation, and everyone knew, suddenly, that being invited had become the most important thing in the world. Here's where the knife slid in. Mrs. Astor's young daughter, Carrie, had assembled a group of friends to perform a dance at the ball and had been practicing for weeks, giddy with excitement. But Alva let it be quietly known that no invitation could be extended to the Astor girl, because tragically, Mrs. Astor had never once called upon Alva. And without that formal social call, the rules Alva now wielded so beautifully made an invitation simply impossible. It was checkmate, delivered with a curtsy. The old Queen's own etiquette had been turned into a cage. Mrs. Astor faced an impossible choice. She could hold her ground, deny her heartbroken daughter the party of the season, and let the girl weep. Or she could swallow decades of pride and do the unthinkable. She chose her daughter. Mrs. Astor's carriage rolled up to the Vanderbilt mansion, and she left her calling card at the door of the woman she'd spent years pretending not to see. With that single card she acknowledged Alva Vanderbilt as an equal. The gate had been forced open, and both women knew exactly what had happened. The ball itself was a triumph, a glittering, riotous spectacle that ran until dawn and cemented the Vanderbilts at the very heart of society they'd been locked out of. But the real victory had come before the first dance. Alva had proven that the old order could be beaten, that new money armed with enough nerve and enough spectacle could batter its way into the innermost circle. It's the classic underdog story. If the underdog owned a French palace and weaponized a children's dance recital. After that night, the walls that guarded high society were never quite so solid again. All it had taken was one woman, one ball, and one perfectly aimed act of ballroom warfare. Summer has arrived, so naturally you flee the city for Newport. The locals sweetly called their seaside homes cottages, which is adorable, because these cottages had 40 rooms, imported marble, and staff you could count in the dozens. You didn't summer in Newport to relax, you summered there to compete. Every meal was a performance, every gown a public statement, every yacht a subtle insult aimed squarely at your neighbour. It was less a holiday and more an unpaid full-time career in showing off. The word cottage was, of course, a magnificent lie, the kind of false modesty that only the truly wealthy can pull off with a straight face. These were among the grandest private homes ever built in America, palaces of stone and gold perched along the cliffs of Rhode Island, staring out at the sea as if daring the ocean to be more impressive. One of them was modelled after an Italian palace, and cost a sum so vast it strains belief, stuffed with marble hauled across an ocean, and gilding applied by the acre. Calling that a cottage is like calling a battleship a canoe. But the understatement was the whole point, a wink that said, "This trifle, oh, we barely think about it." Newport in summer became the beating heart of high society. the place where the entire glittering circus relocated once the city grew too hot. And relocating was a production. You didn't simply pack a bag. You transported an entire household, servants, wardrobes, horses, carriages, and enough gowns to costume an opera. The whole apparatus of your enormous life picked itself up and moved to the coast, all so you could continue the exact same exhausting social warfare, only now with a sea breeze and a better view. Ever taken a vacation that was somehow more stressful than work? These people invented it. The days followed a rhythm as strict as any factory shift, just with prettier scenery. There were morning visits and afternoon drives along the famous seaside avenue, where the whole point was to be seen in your finest carriage by everyone else being seen in theirs. There were bathing excursions where nobody really swam, luncheons that stretched for hours, and endless preparations for the evening's real business. Each event was another chance to demonstrate your wealth, your taste, and your standing, and another chance to fail at all three in front of an audience that never stopped watching. The evenings belonged to the balls and the dinners, and these were where fortunes were quietly spent and reputations quietly won or lost. A Newport hostess might drop a staggering sum on a single party, importing entertainers, drowning her ballroom in flowers, and serving course after course of dishes designed to leave her guests reeling. The competition was relentless. If your neighbour threw a magnificent ball on Tuesday, you were expected to throw a more magnificent one by Friday. It was an arms race measured in orchids and champagne, and the only way to lose was to stop spending. And beneath the ocean views and the marble columns, the same old terror hummed along steadily. Newport wasn't an escape from the pressures of society. It was those pressures, concentrated and served with sea salt. Every friendly smile hid a scorecard. Every casual invitation was a maneuver. You summered among the very same people who could ruin you back in the city, and the intimacy of the little seaside world only sharpened the knives. So you kept performing, kept spending, kept smiling at the ocean as if you hadn't a care in the world, while quietly calculating whether your cottage was grand enough to keep you safe another season. It usually wasn't. It never quite was. Let's introduce your daughter to society, which is a polite way of saying it's time to sell her. The debutante season was one long glittering auction, disguised as a series of parties. A young woman would be dressed, polished, presented, and paraded before a room of eligible bachelors and their calculating mothers, all pretending this was about dancing. One clumsy step, one overheard remark, one rejected suitor, and her value on the market could plummet overnight. No returns, no refunds, no second season. The whole enterprise was wrapped in the loveliest language imaginable. Your daughter was coming out, making her debut, entering society, phrases that sounded like flowers and butterflies, and evenings full of possibility. Strip away the perfume, though, and the machinery underneath was cold and clanking. This was the moment a family formally offered up its daughter to the marriage market, announcing to every ambitious clan in the city that she was available, eligible, and attached to a suitable fortune. She was, in the plainest terms, going on display, and everyone in the room knew exactly what the display was for. The preparation could consume years and a small fortune. A proper young lady had to be trained in every art that might impress. Dancing, music, a bit of French, the graceful management of a fan, and the far more difficult skill of holding an entire conversation without saying a single thing that mattered. She learned to walk, to curtsy, to enter a room, to sit without collapsing under the weight of her own gown. She was, essentially, being manufactured, assembled piece by piece into a flawless, marriageable product. And like any product, she'd be judged mercilessly the instant she hit the shelf. Her debut itself was a lavish affair, often a grand ball thrown expressly to present her, where she'd be introduced to the assembled elite in her finest white gown. From that night forward, the season became a whirlwind of parties, dinners and dances, each one another opportunity to shine or to stumble. She was expected to be charming but not forward, beautiful but not vain, accomplished but never cleverer than the men around her. Ever tried to be dazzling and invisible at the same time? That was the impossible tightrope, and she walked it in heeled slippers with the whole world watching. The mothers, meanwhile, ran the entire operation like generals commanding a campaign. Behind every serene debutante stood a mother calculating alliances, sizing up bachelors, weighing fortunes against family names, and steering her daughter toward the most advantageous match with the subtlety of a chess master. These women had done this dance themselves once, and they knew exactly how quickly a promising season could sour. A daughter who failed to secure a good match reflected on the whole family, and so the pressure poured down on the poor girl from every direction at once, and the cruelty of it was the ticking clock. A debutante had a narrow window, a few precious seasons to attract a proper husband before whispers began about why she hadn't. Linger too long unmarried and society's verdict grew unkind. She risked being quietly filed away as a spinster, a fate spoken of in hushed and pitying tones. So the whole glittering performance carried an undercurrent of genuine desperation. Behind the smiles and the waltzes and the mountains of white lace, a young woman's entire future was being decided in a handful of ballrooms, by people appraising her like a jewel in a shop window. It was the most beautiful marketplace ever built, and she was the merchandise. Here comes the transatlantic trade that ruined so many marriages before they began. Old European nobles had ancient names and crumbling castles, but no cash. New American families had mountains of cash but no titles. The solution was obvious and heartless. Ship your daughter across the ocean to marry a broke duke. In 1895, Consuelo Vanderbilt was famously marched down the aisle toward an English duke she barely knew, reportedly weeping behind her veil while her mother beamed with triumph. It was a trade so tidy that both sides pretended it wasn't a trade at all. The European aristocracy was by this point frequently broke, sitting on grand estates and glorious titles while the actual money had drained away over generations of doing no work whatsoever. American heiresses, by contrast, had money to spare and one thing they couldn't buy at home, a genuine title, a lady or a duchess to stitch onto the family name. So a market bloomed across the Atlantic, matching cash-poor lords with title-hungry dynasties, and everyone involved kept a very straight face about it. The young women at the centre of these deals earned a nickname, the Dollar Princesses. Dozens of American heiresses crossed the ocean to marry into the British and European nobility, hauling colossal dowries with them to prop up sagging estates and pay off aristocratic debts. On paper, it looked like a fairy tale. The American girl becomes a real-life duchess, mistress of an ancient castle, curtsied to by servants. In practice, many of these unions were arranged with all the romance of a livestock sale, and the bride's feelings were rarely the deciding factor. Or a factor at all, really. Consuelo Vanderbilt's story became the most famous of them all, precisely because it was so nakedly transactional. Her mother, the very same Alva who'd stormed society with her ball, had set her heart on making her daughter a duchess, and what Alva wanted, Alva got. Consuelo was reportedly in love with someone else entirely, which mattered not at all. She was steered, pressured, and by some accounts effectively confined until she agreed to marry the Duke of Marlborough, a man who, by his own admission, was marrying her for her money and giving up another love of his own. A romance for the ages, this was not. The wedding was a spectacle, of course, because everything in this world was a spectacle. Crowds gathered, the press swooned, and the bride wept behind her veil, keeping the guests waiting while she composed herself. The enormous Vanderbilt dowry flowed across the ocean to restore the Duke's magnificent but money-hungry estate, and Consuelo became a duchess exactly as her mother had planned. Ever been given precisely the thing you never wanted, gift-wrapped and celebrated by everyone around you. That was Consuelo's wedding day, dressed in the finest lace money could buy. The marriage, unsurprisingly, was miserable, and the couple eventually separated and later had the union annulled, with Alva, in a twist worthy of a novel, testifying that she'd forced the match all along. But Consuelo was hardly alone. Across this gilded generation, countless heiresses were traded for titles and titles for fortunes, and many spent their lives in cold foreign castles far from home, wealthy and titled and thoroughly unhappy. The whole scheme dressed up commerce as romance and called it a triumph. Behind the coronets and the castle gates, a great many of these fairy tales were simply business deals with a bride thrown in, and the bride, more often than not, was the only one who hadn't agreed to the terms. Before any of these grand weddings, there was the truly romantic part, the negotiation. A Gilded Age marriage among the elite wasn't sealed with a kiss. It was sealed with a small army of lawyers arguing over sums that could buy a town. How much cash would the bride's father hand over? Who kept it if things fell apart? What was a crumbling ancestral title actually worth in dollars? Love, if it showed up at all, arrived fashionably late and was politely asked to wait outside. The marriage settlement was the beating financial heart of every important union, and it was hammered out with all the tenderness of a corporate merger. Before the flowers were ordered or the gown was fitted, the two families sat down, or rather, sent their lawyers to sit down and work through the money with grim precision. This was not considered cynical or unromantic in the slightest. It was simply how serious people handled a serious matter, because a marriage among the elite wasn't the joining of two hearts, it was the joining of two fortunes, and fortunes required paperwork. The dowry was the centerpiece of the whole affair. The bride's family was expected to provide a sum of money or property that she brought into the marriage, and among the very wealthy these sums reached dizzying heights. For an American heiress marrying a titled European, the dowry might be enormous, a fortune large enough to rescue an entire estate from ruin. The exact figure was debated, adjusted, and fought over with the intensity of a treaty negotiation, because everyone at the table understood that this number was, in a very real sense, the true meaning of the marriage. But the dowry was only the beginning. There were settlements to arrange for the bride's future security, allowances to be fixed, and property to be assigned. There were clauses about what would happen if the husband died, if the wife died, if there were children, if there were no children. Every possible outcome had to be anticipated and priced. The lawyers pored over these arrangements the way generals pore over maps, because a poorly drafted settlement could leave a bride penniless or a fortune vulnerable. Ever read a contract so long and dire it made you question the entire relationship? This was that, but for your wedding. The groom's side, especially if it came with a title, brought its own peculiar accounting to the table. A title had value, real, negotiable value, and everyone knew it. An ancient name, a seat in the aristocracy, a castle full of ancestors. These were assets, and they were weighed against the bride's cash as if the whole thing were a barter at a very refined market. The unspoken arithmetic was brutal in its clarity. Her millions bought his title elevated her family. Both sides walked away with something, and both sides pretended not to notice how much it resembled shopping. And through all of it, the bride and groom themselves were often barely consulted. The deal was struck between the parents, the family advisors, and the lawyers, with the young couple sometimes reduced to signatures at the bottom of a document that would govern the rest of their lives. Whatever feelings they had, love, dread, indifference, mattered far less than the terms on the page. So the wedding, when it finally came, was less a beginning than a closing ceremony, the celebration of a bargain already sealed in ink. Two people would stand at the altar and vow to love each other, while the truth of their union sat locked in a lawyer's drawer, measured out to the last dollar. Let's talk about your husband's little secret, which is somehow everyone's secret but yours. Among wealthy men of the era, keeping a mistress in a separate, quietly funded household was practically a hobby. Society mostly shrugged, so long as he was discreet and paid his bills on time. You were expected to notice nothing, say nothing, and smile brilliantly at every dinner. It was an open secret balanced on a very thin sheet of ice, and the whole city was watching to see who'd fall through first. The wealthy husband of the Gilded Age operated under a set of rules so generous to himself that they'd be comical if they weren't so cruel to everyone else. A man of means was widely understood to have appetites, and society had quietly decided that indulging them was simply part of being a powerful man. Provided he kept the arrangement out of the newspapers and away from the dinner table, he could maintain a second establishment, a separate home, a separate woman, a separate life, with barely a raised eyebrow from his peers. Discretion, not fidelity, was the only virtue that counted. The mistress herself often lived in a comfortable house, paid for entirely by the gentleman in question, tucked away in a respectable but separate part of town. She might be an actress, a singer, a dancer, a woman of beauty and charm from outside the sealed world of society, chosen precisely because she existed in a different orbit from the wife. He'd visit, he'd provide, and he'd keep the two halves of his life carefully partitioned, like a man maintaining two entirely different households in two entirely different books. The whole arrangement ran on a strict unspoken code of keeping up appearances, and appearances were everything. The wife more often than not knew perfectly well what was happening. In a world where servants gossiped and gossip travelled, and everyone watched everyone, secrets of this size rarely stayed truly secret. But knowing and acknowledging were two very different things. A wife was expected to maintain a serene, untroubled face no matter what she knew, to host the dinners and attend the balls and behave as though her marriage were a portrait of contentment. To let the mask slip, to make a scene, to complain publicly, would have been the real scandal. Ever smiled warmly at a party while quietly aware that everyone knew something awful? That was her nightly performance. The cruelty of the arrangement lay in its lopsidedness. The husband risked almost nothing. His reputation could absorb a discreet affair the way a thick coat absorbs a light rain. His social standing, his fortune, his welcome in every drawing room, none of it was truly threatened, so long as he kept things quiet. He held all the freedom and bore almost none of the risk, protected by a society that had decided long ago that men like him deserved a little latitude. The wife, meanwhile, was bound to a standard so strict it barely let her breathe. Because the ice, thin as it was, only ever cracked beneath one person. If the affair became too public, too messy, too impossible to ignore, it was rarely the husband who paid the heaviest price. The whispers would swirl, and society would cluck its tongue, but he'd usually weather it. The real danger was that the scandal would splash onto the wife, the children, the family name, and that the woman who had done nothing but endure would find herself somehow tarnished by her own husband's indiscretion. So she kept smiling, kept hosting, kept pretending, holding the whole fragile arrangement together with nothing but grace and gritted teeth. His second life was his indulgence. Keeping it from destroying everything was somehow her job. Now flip that entire arrangement around and watch the ceiling collapse. If a husband's affair earned a knowing wink, a wife's affair earned exile. The double standard wasn't subtle, it was structural. A woman even suspected of straying could lose her children, her home, her name, and her place in society, all in a single afternoon of gossip. She could be innocent and still ruined, because in your world, a woman's reputation was made of glass, and everyone was holding a rock. The rules that gave a wealthy husband his generous latitude had a mirror image for his wife, and that mirror was a guillotine. Where his indiscretions were quietly absorbed, hers were treated as catastrophes, not merely personal failures, but threats to the entire social order. A woman's virtue was considered the very foundation of her family's respectability. The thing that guaranteed the bloodline was pure and the inheritance uncontested. So a straying wife wasn't just breaking a private vow. She was, in the eyes of society, cracking the load-bearing wall of the whole house. The reasoning behind the double standard was as cold as it was practical. A husband's affair, however distasteful, didn't threaten the legitimacy of his heirs. A wife's affair, however, raised the unbearable question of whose children she was actually raising, and in a world where fortunes passed down through bloodlines, that question was pure poison. An heir of doubtful parentage could unravel an inheritance, taint a dynasty, and turn a proud family name into a punchline. So a wife's fidelity was guarded not out of tenderness, but out of accounting, and any threat to it was met with merciless force. The consequences fell with terrifying speed and completeness. A woman caught, or even convincingly rumoured, to have strayed could find herself cut off from everything at once. Her invitations vanished. Her friends looked through her. Her husband could cast her out, and the law and society would side firmly with him. Worst of all, she could lose access to her own children, who belonged in the eyes of the era to the father and the family name far more than to her. Ever lost everything you loved over something you might not even have done? That was the shadow every wife lived beneath, and innocence was no shield. The system ran on appearances and whispers, not proof, which meant a woman could be destroyed by suspicion alone. A too friendly conversation, a poorly timed carriage ride, a jealous rival with a talent for rumour, any of it could plant a seed that grew into ruin. Because society was always watching and always eager for a fresh scandal, a wife had to guard not only her actual conduct, but the appearance of her conduct, every hour of every day. She lived under constant surveillance, judged by people delighted to find her guilty. The result was a life lived on a knife's edge of caution. A wealthy wife learned to be endlessly careful, with her words, her friendships, her glances, her every public move, because the margin for error was essentially non-existent. She watched her husband enjoy freedom she could never dream of, and she swallowed it, because the alternative was annihilation. It's a stark portrait of just how uneven the whole glittering world truly was. Two people bound by the same marriage, living under wildly different laws. His secret life was a gentleman's privilege. Hers, real or imagined, was a loaded gun pointed at everything she had. And everyone around her, smiling and sipping their champagne, stood ready to pull the trigger. Let's discuss the word no respectable family dared say aloud: divorce. In an age of forced marriages, cheating husbands and loveless matches, you'd think divorce would be common. Instead, it was catastrophic. A scandal that could exile an entire family from society forever. When Alva Vanderbilt divorced her husband in 1895, she detonated her own reputation on purpose and only survived through sheer, terrifying willpower. Most women who tried it simply vanished from the guest lists and were never spoken of again. The logic of the era practically manufactured miserable marriages. Unions were arranged for money and titles, husbands kept mistresses as a matter of course, and wives were expected to endure it all with a serene smile. You might reasonably expect that a society producing so many unhappy couples would develop some graceful exit. It did not. Instead, it slammed every door shut and declared that a marriage, however wretched, was to be borne in silence until death. To seek release from it was to announce, publicly and permanently, that you had failed at the one performance society demanded you never abandon. Divorce carried a stigma so heavy it could crush not just the couple, but their children, their relatives, and their descendants. A divorced woman especially became a marked figure, whispered about, pitied, and quietly excluded. She'd violated the sacred image of the contented wife, and society punished that violation with exile. The invitation stopped. The old friends grew distant. The doors that had opened so eagerly now stayed firmly closed. She became a cautionary tale, a name spoken in hushed tones to warn other women away from the same cliff. Ever been erased from a group not for what you did wrong, but for admitting you were unhappy? That was her sentence. This is what makes Alva Vanderbilt's divorce so astonishing. By the 1890s, Alva had clawed her way to the very summit of society, and then she did the unthinkable. She divorced her husband over his infidelities, walking away from a marriage that most women would have suffered in silence. It was an act of breathtaking nerve because she knew precisely what it might cost her. She was gambling her hard-won position on the wild bet that she was formidable enough to survive a blow that had destroyed countless women before her. And survive it she did, but only through a force of personality that bordered on the supernatural. Alva refused to slink away or apologize. She held her head high, kept entertaining, and dared society to reject her, and remarkably, it mostly didn't. She simply willed herself back into acceptance through sheer, stubborn magnificence, refusing to accept the exile that the rules prescribed. It was a triumph, but a rare one, achieved by a woman with unusual wealth, unusual will, and an unusual talent for bending the world to her shape. For nearly everyone else, no such rescue existed, because the ordinary woman who divorced simply disappeared. She lacked Alva's fortune, Alva's ferocity, or Alva's peculiar genius for social warfare, and so the machinery of exclusion ground her quietly into obscurity. She lost her standing and never got it back, vanishing from the world she'd known as completely as if she'd died. That was the true horror of divorce in your world. Not that it was forbidden, but that it was permitted at a price almost no one could pay. So trapped wives stayed trapped, smiling through decades of misery, because the only exit led straight off the edge of the map. Freedom existed. It simply cost you everything. Here's a scandal that turned private heartbreak into public theatre. If a gentleman proposed and then changed his mind, a jilted woman could actually sue him for breaking his promise. And when she did, every tender, foolish love letter he'd ever written got read aloud in a courtroom packed with delighted spectators. Nothing destroyed a proud family faster than watching their son's soggy romantic poetry printed in the morning papers. It was the era's version of your private messages leaking to the entire town. The breach of promise suit rested on a simple and rather startling idea. An engagement was a binding contract, and breaking it was a genuine legal wrong. In an age when a woman's marriage prospects were fragile and enormously consequential, a broken engagement could inflict real damage. A jilted woman had, in the cruel arithmetic of the time, been publicly claimed and then publicly discarded, and other suitors might now wonder what was wrong with her. The law, in a rare gesture toward women, allowed her to seek compensation for that damage, to make the man who'd wounded her pay, quite literally, for the harm. But the money was almost beside the point. The true weapon of a breach of promise suit was exposure. To prove her case, the wronged woman would produce evidence of the promise, and the finest evidence of all was the man's own words, penned in the heat of courtship. Those private letters, full of extravagant devotion and swooning declarations, would be entered into the record and read aloud in open court. Every syrupy endearment, every silly pet name, every overheated vow of eternal love would suddenly belong to the public. Ever written something mortifying in a moment of passion? Now imagine a clerk reading it slowly to a packed room. The public devoured these trials with the enthusiasm of theatre-goers at a hit play. Courtrooms filled with spectators eager for a glimpse of the mighty humbled, and the newspapers gleefully reprinted the juiciest passages for readers across the city. A wealthy young man's most embarrassing private effusions could become the talk of every breakfast table, quoted and mocked and passed around like a delicious joke. The grander the family, the greater the delight, because there is no entertainment quite so satisfying as watching the powerful squirm. A proud name could take a beating in a single afternoon that no amount of money could quite repair. For the man and his family, this was precisely the nightmare. A gentleman who'd merely changed his mind, perhaps wisely, could find himself transformed into a national laughingstock, his romantic ramblings dissected by strangers and his family's dignity trampled in the press. The mere threat of such a suit was often enough to change behaviour entirely. Better to marry a woman you'd tired of than to face a courtroom armed with your own gushing letters. In this way, the breach of promise suit gave a jilted woman a genuine and rather terrifying power over the man who'd wronged her. It was, in the end, a strange and revealing corner of your world, a place where the era's obsession with reputation could be turned into a weapon by the very people it usually crushed. A woman with a bundle of old love letters held something dangerous, and everyone knew it. So gentlemen learned to be cautious with their pens, and families learned to dread the phrase itself. Because in a society where your good name was worth more than gold, the threat of having your foolish heart read aloud to a laughing crowd was a threat worth almost any price to avoid. Let's meet the man who got rich off your secrets. A society gossip paper prowled the era, run by a colonel with a magnificent moustache and absolutely no shame. His genius was simple. He'd learned something ruinous about your family, then offered to leave it out of print for a generous fee. Pay up, and you stayed respectable. Refuse, and your worst evening became next week's headline. It was blackmail dressed in a top hat, and half of the high society quietly paid the bill. The society scandal sheet was a peculiar invention of the age. born from the collision of two facts. The wealthy had enormous secrets, and the public was ravenous to read about them. A paper devoted to the doings of high society could turn that hunger into a fortune, and the shrewdest publishers understood that the real money lay not in what they printed, but in what they agreed not to. Information was the product, and silence was the premium service, available naturally to anyone who could pay for it. The method was elegant in its ruthlessness. The paper would gather intelligence on the elite through a web of tipsters, servants, and observers who noticed everything and forgot nothing. When a truly damaging item surfaced, an affair, a debt, a disgrace, a secret that could topple a family, the publisher faced a lucrative choice. He could print it and sell papers, or he could quietly approach the family, hint at what he knew, and offer to bury the story for a fee. Most families, terrified of exposure, chose to pay, and so the publisher collected his money and moved on to the next frightened household. Ever paid dearly for something to simply not happen? That was the whole grim business model. The genius of the scheme lay in how it weaponized the very thing society valued most. In a world where reputation was everything, and a single scandal could mean permanent exile, the threat of exposure was more terrifying than almost any other. The publisher didn't need to lie or invent. The truth was quite enough. He simply had to know a family's secret and let them understand that he knew it. The rest took care of itself, as the family's own dread did the work of extracting the payment. It was a protection racket conducted entirely through the medium of newsprint. And business was brisk, because the elite were positively swimming in secrets worth hiding. The affairs, the debts, the illegitimate children, the ruined fortunes, the quiet cruelties, every glittering family had something buried, and every buried thing was potential ammunition. The publisher sat at the center of this vast field of vulnerabilities like a spider on a web, feeling every tremble, deciding whose secret to squeeze next. He grew wealthy and influential precisely because he understood that in this society, fear was the most reliable currency of all. The whole arrangement revealed something dark about the world these families had built. They'd constructed a society so obsessed with appearances that the mere threat of an unflattering truth could bankrupt them into silence. Their power, their fortunes, their marble mansions, none of it protected them from a man with a printing press and a list of their sins. In fact, their wealth only made them juicier targets. So they paid and paid and paid, buying quiet from a man who profited from their terror. It was one more reminder that in your gilded world, the people who seemed most untouchable were often the most desperately afraid, and someone was always ready to charge them for their fear. Time to head below stairs, where the real power quietly lived. Your butlers, maids, valets and footmen saw every argument, every unpaid bill, every midnight visitor, and every tear you thought was private. They knew which marriages were performances and which fortunes were bluffs. Most stayed loyal, they had to, but a single disgruntled maid with a good memory and a grudge could sell a family's secrets to a gossip paper and topple 4 generations of respectability before you'd finished your soup. A great Gilded Age household ran on an invisible army of servants, dozens of them in the largest homes, each assigned a precise role in the enormous machinery of keeping the family magnificent. There were butlers to command the household, valets and ladies' maids to dress the master and mistress, footmen and cooks and scullery maids and coachmen, all moving through the mansion in a carefully choreographed dance. They were meant to be present but unseen, essential but invisible, a paradox that placed them everywhere in your life while pretending they were nowhere at all. And that invisibility was exactly what made them so dangerous. Because they were always present and rarely noticed, servants witnessed the truth of a family that no outsider ever glimpsed. They saw the master stumble home at dawn and the mistress weep behind closed doors. They heard the arguments through the walls, counted the unpaid bills, noticed the visitors who came when the spouse was away. They knew which grand fortunes were secretly hollow and which serene marriages were bitter wars conducted in whispers. They held, in short, the unedited version of your life, the one you spent all your energy hiding from the world. Ever realize the people cleaning your home knew your secrets better than your friends? That was your daily reality. For the most part, this knowledge stayed safely locked away. Good servants prized discretion, and a reputation for loyalty was essential to their livelihood. A maid known to gossip would never find a respectable position again. Many were genuinely devoted to the families they served, bound by years of proximity and a strange, lopsided intimacy. So the vast machinery of household staff generally kept its silence, and the secrets it guarded remained secret. The system relied on this loyalty absolutely, resting the family's reputation in the hands of the very people who knew exactly how fragile it was. But loyalty had limits, and a mistreated servant was a loaded weapon. A maid dismissed without a reference, a valet cheated of his wages, a housekeeper humiliated one time too many. Any of them might decide that the family's secrets were worth more than their silence. And in an age of scandal sheets hungry for exactly this kind of information, there was always a buyer. A disgruntled servant with a good memory could walk out the door and straight into the office of a gossip publisher, carrying the ammunition to blow a family's carefully built reputation to pieces. The betrayal, when it came from inside the house. This gave the whole relationship a quiet, humming tension beneath its polished surface. The family depended entirely on people they often treated as furniture, and those people held the power to destroy them. It was a strange inversion of the visible hierarchy. The mighty family upstairs, secure in its wealth, was in truth deeply vulnerable to the overlooked figures downstairs. The smartest families understood this and treated their staff with care, not merely out of kindness but out of self-preservation. Because in your gilded world, the greatest threat to your good name wasn't a rival across the ballroom. It was the quiet person who just laid your fork on the table and seen everything. Let's go to the opera, where nobody actually watches the opera. The finest theatre in town had only a handful of private boxes, and the old families guarded them like sacred thrones. When the new money crowd got repeatedly snubbed and denied their own boxes, they did something magnificently petty. In 1883 they built an entirely new, grander opera house out of pure spite. Whole fortunes were spent, whole friendships ended, all over the question of who got to sit where and be admired. The opera in Gilded Age society had almost nothing to do with music, and almost everything to do with visibility. The private boxes that ring the finest theatre were the most coveted seats in the entire social world. Not because of the view of the stage, but because of the view of you. From a box, you could be seen by all of society, displaying your gowns, your jewels, and your standing to the assembled elite. The boxes were thrones, and they were fiercely limited, which meant possessing one was among the surest signs that you'd truly arrived. The trouble was that the old families had claimed those thrones long ago and had no intention of surrendering them. The best boxes at the established opera house were held tightly by the old money set, passed down and guarded jealously, with no room for the ambitious newcomers hammering at the gates. It didn't matter how vast your railroad fortune was. If the old guard controlled the boxes, You could be shut out entirely, forced to watch from lesser seats while lesser people, in your view, lounged in the good ones. For the proud new money families, this was an intolerable insult repeated night after glittering night. So they did what the wealthy and excluded have always done. They refused to accept the answer and simply built their own. Rather than beg for boxes they'd never be given, a group of the richest new money families pooled their staggering fortunes and constructed an entirely new opera house. Bigger, grander, and stuffed with far more of the precious private boxes than the old one had. If the establishment wouldn't make room for them, they'd build an establishment of their own and make room for everyone like them. It was revenge rendered in architecture, a monument to wounded pride with excellent acoustics. The new house, which opened in 1883, was a triumph of spite and spectacle, and it changed the balance of power in the city's social life. Suddenly the old opera house, with its exclusive little cluster of boxes, faced a rival that could seat a much larger swathe of the elite in gilded splendour. The new money families now had their thrones, and they filled them proudly, no longer dependent on the grudging permission of the old guard. Ever solved a problem by building an absurdly expensive alternative purely to prove a point. These families turned that impulse into a landmark. The whole saga captured something essential about your world. These were people of nearly unlimited means locked in a struggle not over anything useful, but over the pure question of status, of who got to sit where and be admired by whom. The sums involved were colossal, the effort immense, and the underlying dispute almost childishly simple. They wanted the good seats, and they'd been told no. That two competing opera houses could be born from a fight over private boxes tells you everything about how seriously this society took its rankings. The music played on, magnificent and largely ignored, while the real drama unfolded in the boxes where fortunes clashed over the priceless right to be seen. Let's talk about your wardrobe, which quietly ate a mansion. The most fashionable women imported their gowns straight from a famous Paris designer, each one a hand-sewn masterpiece costing a small fortune. And you couldn't be seen twice in the same dress, so the bills never stopped arriving. Some husbands watched their bank accounts drain away one exquisite ball gown at a time, ruined not by gambling or bad investments, but by lace, silk, and the merciless demand to never, ever repeat an outfit. The pinnacle of fashion in your world came from Paris, where a celebrated designer had essentially invented the idea of high fashion as an art form. His creations were not mere dresses. They were elaborate masterpieces of silk, satin, lace, and hand embroidery, each one constructed with painstaking craftsmanship over countless hours. To wear one was to announce, instantly and unmistakably, that you belonged among the very finest of society. And so, every woman with ambition and access set her heart on filling her closets with these Parisian marvels, whatever the cost. The cost, it turned out, was extraordinary. A single one of these gowns could carry a price that would make an ordinary person faint, the equivalent of a labourer's wages for a very long time indeed, stitched into a garment you'd wear for a few hours. But the crushing part wasn't the price of one dress, it was the volume. A fashionable woman needed gowns for every conceivable occasion. Morning dresses, walking dresses, tea gowns, dinner gowns, ball gowns, and she needed a great many of each, because the unforgiving rules of society forbade her from being seen too often in the same one. Her wardrobe wasn't a collection, it was a bottomless, ever-refilling expense. The rule against repetition was the true engine of financial ruin. In a world where everyone watched everyone, wearing the same gown to too many events marked you as either poor or careless, and both were fatal. so the fashionable woman needed a constant stream of fresh creations, an endless parade of new masterpieces flowing across the ocean from Paris, to keep her from the humiliation of being seen twice in the same silk. The orders never stopped, the shipments never ceased, and the bills piled up like snowdrifts. Eva felt pressure to never repeat an outfit. Now imagine each outfit cost as much as a house. For the husbands footing these bills, the consequences could be genuinely catastrophic. We tend to imagine Gilded Age fortunes destroyed by dramatic causes, reckless gambling, foolish investments, market panics. But some were bled to death far more quietly, drained gown by gown, season by season, by the relentless demands of high fashion. A man could watch his wealth erode not through any single disaster, but through the steady, unstoppable outflow required to keep his wife dressed at the summit of style. The mansion, the horses, the entire glittering life demanded a wardrobe, and the wardrobe was hungry. And here lies the cruel logic of it all. The extravagant spending wasn't vanity for its own sake. It was a grim necessity of maintaining social position. A woman dressed below the standard risked her family's standing, so the gowns were, in a sense, mandatory, armour for the endless war of appearances. To economise was to invite whispers, and whispers could ruin you as surely as bankruptcy. So the families spent, and spent, and spent, chasing a standard that only rose higher each season, until some of them spent themselves right off the edge. It's a strange kind of ruin to be undone by beauty. But in your world, the price of looking untouchable was often the very thing that touched you. Now let's add the jewels, because a fortune isn't a fortune until it's dangling from your neck. Gilded Age women waged silent warfare with diamonds, sapphires, and tiaras heavy enough to strain the spine. Every gala became a glittering contest to see who could outsparkle the room. The problem was that gemstones this dazzling cost more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes, and more than one proud family quietly went broke trying to make sure their wife shone brighter than the woman across the ballroom. If the Paris gowns were the battlefield, the jewels were the heavy artillery. A great lady of your world didn't merely wear jewellery, she deployed it, draping herself in diamonds and emeralds and ropes of pearls until she gleamed like a chandelier come to life. The finest pieces were staggering, necklaces heavy with enormous stones, tiaras that crowned the head with a small fortune, brooches and bracelets and rings all competing for space on a single dazzling figure. To enter a ballroom properly adorned was to arrive armoured in wealth, every facet catching the light and announcing your family's power. The competition was relentless and unspoken, conducted entirely through the medium of sparkle. When one woman appeared at a gala wearing a magnificent new necklace, every other woman in the room registered it instantly, calculated its worth, and began plotting how to answer. The next great event would see a rival appear in something even grander. And so the escalation continued, each lady straining to outdazzle the last. It was an arms race in the most literal sense, an endless upward spiral of acquisition where standing still meant falling behind. Ever felt you had to keep up with someone who kept raising the bar? Now imagine the bar was encrusted with diamonds and the whole city was keeping score. The sums involved were almost incomprehensible. The truly spectacular pieces cost fortunes that could have built mansions or funded businesses, representing more wealth than most human beings would see in many lifetimes of labour. And these weren't one-time purchases. A lady of fashion needed jewels to suit different gowns and different occasions, an ever-growing collection to match her ever-growing wardrobe. The jewellers of the age grew rich serving this bottomless appetite, crafting ever more elaborate pieces for clients who simply had to have something no one else possessed. The demand for uniqueness drove prices to dizzying heights, and the families paid because to be outshone was unthinkable. For all its glamour, this glittering warfare carried real and ruinous consequences. Just as the gowns could quietly drain a fortune, so too could the jewels, perhaps even more dramatically given their staggering individual cost. A family determined to keep its lady the brightest star in every room might pour a shocking portion of its wealth into gemstones, chasing a supremacy that lasted only until the next gala, the next rival, the next magnificent necklace. The stones held their value certainly, but the relentless need to acquire more and finer and rarer could hollow out even an impressive fortune with alarming speed. And so the diamonds tell the same story as the dresses, only harder and colder. Beneath the beauty lay a brutal competition for status, one that treated priceless gemstones as mere ammunition in an unwinnable war. The women who blazed brightest at the great balls were often standing at the centre of a family straining under the weight of that brilliance, their splendour purchased at a cost that quietly threatened everything. It's a dazzling image, a woman ablaze with a fortune in jewels, but look closely and you might see the strain behind the sparkle. In your world, even the light that made you magnificent could be the thing that burned you down. Let's follow the gentleman into a very elegant room where money goes to die. Behind discreet doors, the wealthy gathered at plush gambling houses to wager sums that could feed a village for a year. The decor was gorgeous, the drinks were free, and the losses were biblical. A man could stroll in an heir to millions and stagger out at dawn owning almost nothing, having politely handed his family's entire future to a smiling dealer over a single unlucky evening at the card table. The gentlemen of your world had their own arenas of ruin, and among the grandest were the private gambling establishments that catered to the very rich. These were not seedy dens, but sumptuous places, decorated with the same lavish care as the finest mansions, thick carpets, gleaming chandeliers, fine liquor flowing freely, and an atmosphere of hushed, expensive excitement. A wealthy man could pass an evening here in perfect comfort, surrounded by his peers, weighted on hand and foot, all while quietly wagering sums that could have supported an entire community for a year. The elegance was part of the trap. It made losing a fortune feel like a refined amusement. The games themselves, cards, dice, the turn of a wheel, carried stakes scaled to the enormous wealth of the players. A single hand could involve a wager larger than most people earned in a decade, and the fortunes rose and fell across the green bays with breathtaking speed. For men accustomed to commanding vast sums, the thrill of risking them at the table was intoxicating, a rush that the safe management of inherited money could never provide. And the houses naturally were designed to encourage exactly this recklessness, plying their guests with drink and flattery while the odds ground steadily in the house's favour. The danger, of course, was that the losses could be as vast as the wealth. A man having a bad night could watch staggering sums vanish across the table, chasing his losses deeper and deeper into the dark in the desperate hope of one redeeming hand. The free-flowing liquor blurred his judgment. The plush surroundings softened the horror of what was happening, and by dawn he might find himself owing more than he could comprehend. A fortune built over generations could be gutted in a single evening by a proud man who couldn't bring himself to leave the table. Ever watch someone dig a hole and keep digging? Now imagine the shovel was made of gold and the hole was his family's future. The consequences reached far beyond the gambler himself. A man who lost catastrophically at the tables didn't merely damage his own prospects. He threatened his entire family, his wife's security, his children's inheritance, the whole magnificent edifice of the family name. Gambling debts among gentlemen were considered debts of honour, to be paid promptly and without question, which meant a ruinous night couldn't simply be ignored or escaped. The money had to be found, whatever the cost, and finding it might mean selling property, liquidating investments, or quietly begging relatives for rescue. One evening's folly could echo through a family for years. And so the gambling houses stand as another of your world's beautiful traps, luxurious rooms where the powerful went to feel the thrill of risk and sometimes lost everything that mattered. They reveal a restless, reckless streak running beneath the polished surface of Gilded Age wealth, a hunger for excitement among men who had everything and were bored by it. The velvet and crystal made ruin look elegant, but ruin it remained. Behind the discreet doors, fortunes that had taken generations to build could evaporate before sunrise, handed over with a gentleman's smile to a dealer who'd seen it all 100 times before. In your world, even losing everything was done in the finest possible taste. Every great family had one, and tonight he's yours, the wastrel son. Raised in unimaginable luxury with no reason to ever work, some Gilded Age heirs simply dissolved into a fog of champagne, scandal, and spectacularly bad decisions. They crashed carriages, lost fortunes, embarrassed their mothers, and generally treated the family name like a toy to be broken. It took generations of ruthless effort to build these dynasties, and sometimes only one charming, useless young man to cheerfully drink the whole thing to the ground. The wastrel heir was a recurring character in the great families of your world, and his existence flowed almost inevitably from the conditions of his birth. Consider his situation. Born into staggering wealth, handed everything he could ever want, and given no reason whatsoever to strive for anything. The fortune was already made, the mansions already built, the servants already hired. He had nothing to prove and nothing to do, and for a certain kind of young man, that combination proved absolutely corrosive. Without the discipline of necessity, he simply drifted, and the drifting often led somewhere dark. His days had no shape, and his money had no limit. A dangerous pairing for anyone. He might rise at noon, fritter away the afternoon, and pour himself into the evening's pleasures with the enthusiasm of a man who never had to answer for tomorrow. Champagne flowed endlessly. The gambling tables beckoned. Fast horses and faster company filled his hours, and every reckless impulse could be indulged the instant it rose, because there was always more money and never any consequences. He became a connoisseur of excess, treating his family's fortune as a bottomless well he could draw from forever. Ever seen someone with unlimited resources and zero direction? The results were rarely pretty and often expensive. The trouble was that his behaviour didn't stay private. A wastrel heir was a public embarrassment, and in a society obsessed with reputation, his antics could inflict real damage on the family name. He might be involved in unsavoury scandals, seen in disreputable company, or caught in some humiliating escapade that set the whole city gossiping. His poor mother, who had likely fought fierce battles to secure the family's social standing, watched in horror as her son cheerfully undid her work with each new disgrace. The dynasty she'd helped build for her children was being frittered away by one of those very children, and there was often little she could do to stop him, and the financial damage could match the social kind. A truly dedicated wastrel could burn through astonishing sums, hemorrhaging money through gambling, extravagance, and sheer careless waste. Fortunes that had taken shrewd, ruthless ancestors decades to accumulate could be meaningfully depleted by a single generation of determined dissipation. The men who'd built these empires as titans of discipline and ambition. Their pampered descendants sometimes possessed neither quality, and the contrast could be fatal to the family's wealth. It's the old pattern the world has seen again and again. The first generation builds, the second maintains, and the third, raised in softness, squanders. There's something almost tragic in it, beneath the champagne and the scandal. These young men were, in a sense, victims of their own good fortune, handed so much that they never developed the character to handle any of it. Their lives, for all the luxury, often curdled into aimlessness and ruin, a slow-motion collapse fueled by too much money and too little purpose. And their families paid the price, watching helplessly as the products of so much struggle were poured away by someone who'd never struggled for anything. It's a peculiar lesson tucked inside all that gold, that giving a person everything can be its own kind of cruelty, and that the surest way to destroy a great fortune was sometimes simply to hand it, untouched and unearned, to the wrong charming young man. Let's talk about the night a scandal turned deadly. Wealthy men in this era guarded their honour like a fragile heirloom, and love triangles among the powerful could end in blood. In 1872, a flamboyant financier was shot dead on a hotel staircase by a rival, all over the affections of the same glamorous woman. The murder gripped the entire country. It was a brutal reminder that beneath all the silk and civility, these people were perfectly capable of destroying each other in the most literal way. The financier in question was one of the most colourful and notorious figures of his age, a flashy, roguish speculator who'd made and manipulated fortunes with a showman's flair and lived exactly as loudly as you'd expect. He was rich, he was famous, he was scandalous, and he was involved with a beautiful and much-desired woman who was, unfortunately for everyone, also entangled with another man. That other man was his business associate turned bitter rival, and the two of them circled the same woman with a jealousy that curdled slowly and then suddenly into something lethal. The tangle of money, love and wounded pride grew more poisonous by the month. These were not men accustomed to being denied or humiliated, and the situation offered ample opportunity for both. Accusations flew, tempers frayed, and the rivalry that might have stayed a private matter spilled into public view, feeding the newspapers a steady diet of intrigue. When powerful men with fragile egos compete over the same woman while fortunes hang in the balance, the mixture becomes unstable, and this particular mixture was reaching its breaking point. Ever watched two proud people refuse to back down until something shattered? This was that, with pistols. The end came on a hotel staircase in full view of witnesses, when the rival confronted the financier and simply shot him. There was no duel with seconds and rules, no dramatic build-up, just a sudden, brutal act of violence in an elegant public place, blood spreading across the fine carpet of a respectable establishment. The glamorous world of high finance and glittering scandal collapsed, in an instant, into something raw and terrible. The mighty financier, who had bent markets to his will and lived like a king, died on the steps like anyone else, felled by a jealous man with a gun. The murder became a national sensation, devoured by a public that could hardly believe the sordid drama unfolding among the elite. The trial that followed had everything the newspapers could dream of: sex, money, celebrity, betrayal, and death, all bound up in the affairs of the rich and infamous. The whole country followed every twist, feasting on a scandal that exposed the passions seething beneath the polished surface of high society. Here were people of enormous wealth and standing, undone not by market panics or social snubs, but by the oldest and most primal forces of all: jealousy, desire, and rage. The affair left a lasting mark precisely because it stripped away the illusion. It's tempting to imagine the elite of your world as creatures of pure refinement, waging their battles only through calling cards and cold shoulders. But beneath the etiquette ran the same hot blood that has always driven human beings to ruin. These were people capable of genuine violence, of murder committed in broad daylight over matters of the heart. The silk and the manners were real, but so were the passions they barely contained, and on one bloody staircase, in front of horrified witnesses, the gilded world revealed just how thin its veneer of civility truly was. Now let's watch a fortune evaporate before breakfast. For all their marble and diamonds, these families balanced their wealth on borrowed money and blind confidence. When the market cracked, as it did brutally in 1873 and again in 1893, the whole illusion collapsed at once. A man could go to sleep a titan and wake up owing more than he could ever repay. The mansions, the yachts, the Paris gowns, all of it could vanish in a single trembling afternoon on Wall Street. The great fortunes of your world looked eternal, carved in limestone and dripping with gold, but many of them rested on foundations far shakier than they appeared. Wealth in this era was often built on speculation, borrowed money, and interconnected investments that soared magnificently in good times and unravelled catastrophically in bad ones. A man might command a paper empire worth millions, yet owe enormous sums against it. His grandeur balanced precariously on the assumption that the good times would simply continue. As long as confidence held, the whole structure stood tall. When confidence cracked, it came down like a house built of playing cards. And crack it did, more than once, in violent financial panics that swept through the economy and left ruin in their wake. The panics of 1873 and 1893 were especially brutal. Sudden collapses that turned booming prosperity into desperate crisis almost overnight. Banks failed, businesses collapsed, credit vanished, and the intricate web of investments and debts that sustained so many great fortunes simply tore apart. Men who had seemed invincible found themselves staring into an abyss, their wealth revealed as the illusion it had partly always been. The speed of the destruction was the most terrifying part. In these panics, fortunes didn't erode gently over years. They vanished in days, sometimes in hours. A man could conduct his affairs one afternoon as a titan of industry and confront total ruin by the next morning, his investments worthless, his debts suddenly due, his creditors circling. The very leverage that had multiplied his wealth in good times now multiplied his losses, dragging him down faster than he could possibly react. Ever felt the ground vanish beneath you with no warning? For these men, that feeling arrived with the morning newspaper and a stack of demands for payment. The consequences reached into every corner of the gilded life. When a fortune collapsed, it took everything with it. The mansions had to be sold, the yachts surrendered, the servants dismissed, the Paris gowns and the diamond tiaras quietly liquidated to satisfy the creditors. The family that had reigned over society one season could find itself scrambling and disgraced the next, its glittering world dismantled piece by piece. And with the money went the social standing, for a family that could no longer afford the performance quickly found itself dropped from the guest lists it had once dominated. Financial ruin and social ruin marched hand in hand. This precariousness haunted even the mightiest, a shadow lurking behind all the confidence and display. However secure a fortune seemed, its owner knew somewhere in the back of his mind that the whole thing could come apart in a market convulsion he'd never see coming. The wealth that bought the marble and the diamonds could not buy true safety, because it rested on forces no single family could control. So beneath the swagger ran a current of genuine fear, the knowledge that titans could fall, and fall fast. In your world, the higher you built and the more you borrowed to build it, the further you had to drop when the ground finally gave way, and the ground, sooner or later, always did. Let's talk about how the money was really made, which was often quietly criminal. Behind many glittering fortunes lay bribery, rigged deals, crushed rivals, and books cooked to a golden brown. For years, nobody asked questions. But when a scheme finally unravelled in public, an exposed swindle, a ruined partner, a scandal splashed across the papers, the fall was spectacular. A family celebrated one season could become a national disgrace the next, undone not by their enemies, but by the very tricks that built their empire. The great fortunes of the age didn't materialize from thin air or from honest thrift alone. Many were built through methods that range from the ruthlessly sharp to the outright criminal, a world of bribed officials, secret arrangements, manipulated markets, and rivals systematically crushed by any means available. The men who amassed these empires often operated in a lawless economic frontier where the rules were few and the enforcement was weaker still. They bought politicians, rigged prices, watered stock, and destroyed competitors with a cold efficiency that would build dynasties and occasionally land them in the newspapers for all the wrong reasons. For much of the time this simply worked, and worked spectacularly. In an era of loose regulation and looser scruples, a determined and unscrupulous operator could accumulate staggering wealth while facing few consequences. The schemes hummed along in the shadows, the money poured in, and the resulting fortunes bought the mansions, the respectability, and the social standing that laundered their grubby origins into gilded prestige. Society, ever willing to overlook a great deal in exchange for a great fortune, mostly declined to ask how the sausage had been made. The money spoke louder than any questions. But schemes have a way of unravelling, and when they did, the collapse could be breathtaking. A swindle exposed, a partner ruined and vengeful, an investigation that finally dug too deep, any of these could drag a family's secret methods into the harsh light of public scrutiny. And once the ugly truth was out, splashed across the front pages for a scandalized public to devour, there was often no containing it. The carefully constructed image of respectability shattered, revealing the bribery and fraud beneath, and the family that had been feted in every ballroom suddenly found itself the subject of horrified whispers and cold shoulders. Ever watched a polished reputation crack to reveal the rot inside? The public of your world adored the spectacle. The fall from grace could be as total as the rise had been impressive. Exposure brought not only social ruin but sometimes legal jeopardy, financial collapse, and the bitter destruction of everything the fortune had purchased. The very aggressiveness that had built the empire now accelerated its demise, as ruined rivals and betrayed associates emerged eager for revenge, and the public appetite for a mighty figure's downfall proved bottomless. A name that had commanded fear and respect became a byword for corruption, and the family bore the stain long after the headlines faded. There's a grim justice woven through these downfalls, and also a grim irony. These families were so often destroyed not by outside forces, but by the consequences of their own methods, the criminal shortcuts that had made them rich finally circling back to devour them. The empire built on fraud contained from its very foundation the seeds of its own destruction, waiting only for the right moment to sprout. It's a recurring lesson in the story of your world, that the fortunes which shone brightest were sometimes the dirtiest underneath, and that the aggressive genius which raised a family to glory could, in a single exposed scandal, cast it right back down into disgrace. Here's a quiet horror that haunted every wealthy household. Someone, somewhere, was keeping your secrets in a drawer. Blackmail flourished in the Gilded Age precisely because these families had so much to hide and so much to lose. A stolen letter, a witnessed indiscretion, a servant with a long memory, any of it could be turned into a lifelong tax on your peace of mind. You paid, and you kept paying, because the alternative was watching your family name burn in tomorrow's headlines. Blackmail thrived in your world because the conditions for it were absolutely perfect. Here was a society obsessed with reputation, where a single exposed scandal could mean permanent ruin, populated by families who were fairly bursting with secrets worth hiding. Affairs, debts, illegitimate children, criminal business dealings, hidden disgraces of every kind. The elite carried a heavy load of hidden shame, and every ounce of it was potential leverage for anyone who learned of it. Where there is so much to conceal and so much to lose, the blackmailer finds fertile ground, and the Gilded Age offered him a garden. The ammunition could come from anywhere, which was part of what made the threat so pervasive. A love letter written in a foolish moment and somehow gone astray. An indiscretion witnessed by the wrong pair of eyes. A servant who'd worked in the house for years and remembered everything he'd seen. A business associate who knew where the bodies were buried, sometimes almost literally. Any of these could become the seed of a blackmail scheme, a piece of dangerous knowledge in the hands of someone willing to trade silence for money. And in a world so full of watchers and whisperers, such knowledge was distressingly easy to come by. Once a blackmailer had his hooks in, the arrangement rarely ended cleanly. The wealthy victim, terrified of exposure, would pay to keep the secret buried, and having paid once, would often find himself paying again and again as the blackmailer returned to the well he'd discovered. It became a lifelong tax, a permanent drain on both the fortune and the peace of mind of the person being squeezed. The victim could never truly relax, never be certain the demands wouldn't resume, never know when the knock might come or the note might arrive. Ever paid to make a threat go away, only to realize it would never really be gone? That was the blackmailer's grim genius. The psychological toll could be as heavy as the financial one. To live under the shadow of blackmail was to live in a state of constant gnawing anxiety, forever aware that your ruin sat in someone else's drawer, waiting. Every day carried the possibility of exposure. Every stranger might be the one who knew. The wealthy victim, surrounded by luxury and outwardly serene, might inwardly be consumed by dread, held hostage by a secret and the person who possessed it. All the money in the world couldn't buy back the safety that a single dangerous piece of knowledge had stolen away. This was one of the darker prices of your world's obsession with appearances. By building a society where reputation was everything and exposure was fatal, the elite had made themselves perfectly vulnerable to anyone who learned their secrets. Their wealth, far from protecting them, only made them richer targets, more able to pay, and more desperate to. So the letters sat in drawers across the city, and the quiet payments flowed, and the powerful lived in fear of the overlooked people who held their fates. In a world of such glittering surfaces, the most valuable thing anyone could own turned out to be someone else's secret. Let's whisper about the family secret hidden a few streets away. In a world built on bloodlines and inheritance, an illegitimate child was a live grenade. A powerful man's past affair could resurface at the worst possible moment, threatening fortunes, marriages, and carefully arranged wills. Families spent enormous sums to keep such secrets buried: hush payments, quiet relocations, sealed lips. But secrets like these had a cruel habit of clawing their way to the surface, usually just in time to ruin a wedding or shatter a reputation. In a society organized entirely around bloodlines and the orderly passing of fortunes from one generation to the next, an illegitimate child represented a genuine catastrophe waiting to happen. Such a child was living proof of an indiscretion, a walking scandal, and worse, a potential claimant on a fortune meticulously intended for legitimate heirs. The whole elaborate machinery of inheritance, marriage, and family standing depended on the bloodline being clear and uncontested, and an unacknowledged child threw that clarity into chaos. It was, in the coldest terms, a threat to the money, and in your world, threats to the money were taken very seriously indeed. The typical source of such a secret was a powerful man's past, an affair conducted years earlier, perhaps with a mistress or a servant or some woman outside his sealed social world that had produced a child he'd never openly acknowledged. For a time, the matter might stay safely buried, the child raised quietly elsewhere, the connection known only to a few. But the secret never truly died. It simply waited. And it had a genuinely cruel sense of timing, tending to resurface at precisely the moment it could do the most damage, on the eve of an important marriage, during the settling of a great inheritance, or amid some delicate social ascent. Keeping these secrets buried required constant effort and often enormous sums of money. Families and the men who'd created these situations would pay to maintain silence, supporting the child and mother discreetly, relocating them far from prying eyes, purchasing the cooperation of anyone who knew. Hush payments flowed to keep tongues still, and elaborate arrangements were made to ensure the inconvenient truth stayed hidden behind a wall of money and misdirection. The cost could be considerable, but it was reckoned a bargain against the alternative, which was public disgrace and possibly a fight over the fortune itself. Ever paid dearly to keep the past from catching up with you? For these families, it was an ongoing expense. Yet secrets of this nature had a stubborn way of refusing to stay buried. A grown child might come seeking recognition or a share of the inheritance. A former mistress, angry or desperate, might decide the time had come to speak. A blackmailer might catch the scent and begin his demands. Any number of forces could drag the hidden truth into the light, and when it emerged, the damage could be devastating. A ruined marriage, a contested will, a proud family name suddenly the subject of scandalized gossip. The grenade, so carefully hidden away, would finally go off, and the shrapnel could tear through everything the family had built. Behind these cold calculations lay real human tragedy. easy to lose amid the talk of bloodlines and fortunes. There were actual children caught in these arrangements, denied acknowledgement and relegated to the shadows to protect the reputations of powerful men. There were women brought into silence, and families twisted by the effort of concealment. The obsession with pure bloodlines and unblemished names produced genuine cruelty, sacrificing real people to the demands of appearance and inheritance. It's one more reminder that beneath the gilded surface of this world ran currents of quiet human wreckage, secrets that were also people, hidden away a few streets from the mansions, waiting. Now let's open the door no one talks about. Not every family member fit the polished image, and the Gilded Age had a chilling solution for the inconvenient ones. A relative who was ill, unstable, or simply an embarrassment might be discreetly shipped off to a private asylum or a distant estate, and gently erased from conversation. It was reputation management at its coldest, protecting the family name by pretending an entire human being had never existed, and everyone in society politely agreed to forget. The relentless emphasis on appearances created a genuine problem whenever a family member failed, through no fault of their own or otherwise, to fit the image. A relative struggling with mental illness, a chronic and visible disability, an addiction, or simply behavior the family found humiliating posed a threat to the carefully maintained facade of respectability. In a world where the family name had to gleam without a single blemish, such a person became an inconvenience the family felt compelled to manage, and the management in this era could be chillingly cold, treating a human being as a problem to be hidden rather than a loved one to be cared for. The favoured solution was removal, quiet, discreet, and permanent. The inconvenient relative might be sent away to a private asylum, an institution catering to wealthy families who needed a place to deposit their embarrassments away from public view. Or they might be relocated to a distant family estate, kept comfortable perhaps, but firmly out of sight, tucked into some remote corner of the family's holdings where no one important would ever encounter them. The specifics varied, but the principle was constant. The person was to be moved off stage, beyond the reach of gossip where their existence could no longer threaten the family's standing. And then came the truly cold part, the erasure. Once removed, the inconvenient relative was gently edited out of the family's story. Their name stopped being mentioned. Their place at gatherings quietly vanished. Questions about them were deflected or met with vague murmurs. Over time, it could seem as though they had never existed at all. So thoroughly were they scrubbed from the family's public narrative. This wasn't merely neglect. It was an active pretense, a collective agreement to behave as if a whole human being had simply evaporated. Ever watched someone become an unmentionable subject? A person turned into a silence. That was the fate awaiting the inconvenient. Society, for its part, played along with quiet complicity. The elite understood these arrangements perfectly well, because most great families had their own hidden relatives, their own carefully managed embarrassments. So there existed an unspoken agreement not to inquire too closely, not to ask what had become of the daughter who disappeared or the brother no one spoke of anymore. Everyone's family had secrets of this kind, and so everyone politely averted their eyes from everyone else's. The whole society colluded in the great forgetting, each family protecting its own silences by respecting the silences of others. There is real darkness in this, easy to see once the gilded surface is stripped away. Behind the polished image lay human beings discarded for the crime of being inconvenient, the ill, the different, the troubled, sacrificed to the demands of reputation, and hidden away where they couldn't tarnish the family name. They were denied not only care and acceptance, but their very place in the family's memory, erased as thoroughly as if they'd never lived. It reveals just how ruthless the obsession with appearances could become, cold enough to disown a human being for failing to sparkle. In your world, the family name was protected at almost any cost, and sometimes that cost was a person, sent quietly away and gently forgotten. Let's experience the single deadliest weapon in your world, being ignored on purpose. It was called the cut, a deliberate public refusal to acknowledge someone's existence. A powerful woman would simply look straight through you at a party as if you were furniture, and just like that, the whole room understood you were finished. Once your name quietly disappeared from the social register that ranked who mattered, invitations dried up, doors closed, and your family drifted into a silence from which most never returned. The cut was social warfare distilled to its purest and most elegant form, and it required no weapons, no words, not even a raised voice. To deliver it, a person of high standing simply refused to acknowledge another's existence in public, declining to return a greeting, looking straight through them as though they were empty air, treating them as beneath notice entirely. In a society where recognition from the right people was the very currency of belonging, this deliberate withholding of recognition was a devastating blow. It said, without saying anything at all, that the cut person no longer counted, and everyone watching understood the message instantly. What made the cut so lethal was its public nature and the way it mobilized the entire room. When a powerful figure cut someone at a gathering, the act wasn't private. It was witnessed by all of society's watchful eyes. And those eyes drew the obvious conclusion at once. This person had fallen out of favour, and to associate with them now was to risk one's own standing. So the cut spread outward like a ripple, as others followed the powerful figure's lead, and the victim found themselves suddenly, coldly alone in a room full of people who had, moments before, been friends. Ever felt an entire group turn against you in an instant over some invisible signal? The cut weaponized exactly that horror. The formal counterpart to the cut was removal from the social register, the published guide that ranked and listed the families who truly mattered. To appear in its pages was to be certified as a member of proper society. To be dropped from it was to be officially declared a nobody. When a family's name quietly vanished from that register, the message was unmistakable and permanent. They had been struck from the role of the elect, their membership in the sealed world of society revoked, and everyone who consulted the register would see the absence and understand it. The exclusion, once merely social, became documented and definitive. The consequences cascaded from there with brutal efficiency. Once a person or family had been cut and struck from the register, the invitations simply stopped arriving. The doors that had opened so readily now stayed closed. Old acquaintances grew distant, then vanished. The whole apparatus of social life that had sustained the family's position withdrew all at once, leaving them stranded outside the world they'd inhabited. And this exclusion tended to be permanent, for society rarely reversed its verdicts. A family cast out drifted into an obscurity from which there was usually no path back, their gilded life quietly ending not with a bang but with an unbroken silence. The terrifying elegance of the cut lay in how it required no confrontation, no accusation, no proof of any wrongdoing. Society could destroy a person simply by deciding collectively and without explanation to stop seeing them. There was no appeal, no trial, no chance to defend oneself, only the sudden, chilling discovery that one had become invisible to everyone who mattered. It was punishment by erasure, exile enforced through nothing but averted eyes and unreturned greetings. In a world built on being seen by the right people, the deadliest fate of all was to become, in an instant and forever, someone no one would look at. And a single cut delivered by the right hand could accomplish it. Let's attend the party that the entire country came to hate. In 1897, in the middle of a brutal economic depression, one family threw a costume ball so obscenely lavish it stunned even the wealthy. While much of the nation struggled, guests dressed as kings and queens and danced beneath a fortune in flowers. The public backlash was so fierce, so personal, and so relentless that the humiliated hosts eventually fled the country to escape it. Sometimes the scandal that destroys you is simply too much luxury at the wrong moment. By the late 1890s, the great families of your world had thrown countless extravagant parties, each one straining to outshine the last in a competition of pure spectacle. But the costume ball of 1897 pushed the excess past a line the public was no longer willing to tolerate. The hosts imagined a magnificent triumph, a party for the ages that would cement their glory in the annals of society. Guests were invited to come dressed as royalty and historical figures, draped in jewels and finery, and the setting was drowned in flowers and luxury on a scale that dazzled even the jaded elite. On its own terms, it was a stunning success. The trouble was its timing, which was catastrophically, obliviously wrong. The country was mired in a severe economic depression, one of the worst in memory, with vast numbers of ordinary people out of work, hungry and desperate. Against that grim backdrop, the spectacle of the wealthiest families in the land dressing as kings and queens and squandering a fortune on a single night's amusement struck the public as grotesque. It wasn't merely extravagant, it was an insult, a gilded slap in the face to a suffering nation, and the nation noticed. The very lavishness the hosts had intended as a triumph became the instrument of their disgrace. The backlash was ferocious and deeply personal. Newspapers savaged the ball and its hosts, holding the event up as a symbol of everything wrong with the greedy, heedless elite. Editorials thundered, cartoons mocked, and public sentiment curdled into genuine anger directed squarely at the families involved. The criticism wasn't the polite gossip of the drawing room, it was a national fury, loud and sustained and impossible to ignore. The hosts found themselves not celebrated but reviled, transformed overnight from social royalty into public villains, their names attached to a byword for obscene excess. Ever thrown a party you thought would make you and instead watched it unmake you? This was that nightmare, magnified across an entire country. The consequences proved as severe as the backlash was fierce. The humiliation heaped upon the hosts was so relentless and so inescapable that they ultimately fled the country to escape it, seeking refuge abroad from a public that would not let the matter rest. It was a stunning reversal, a family that had reached for the pinnacle of social glory instead driven into exile by the very event meant to crown them. Their fortune remained intact, but their standing had been savaged, undone not by any crime or hidden scandal, but by a spectacular error in reading the mood of the moment. The lesson buried in this disaster was a subtle but important one. Extravagance had always been the language of your world, the very means by which families competed and displayed their power. But extravagance existed in a context, and when that context turned, when the nation was suffering and watching, the same lavishness that once impressed could suddenly enrage. The hosts of the 1897 ball forgot that even the elite did not live entirely apart from the wider world, that the public's tolerance had limits, and that flaunting obscene wealth amid widespread misery could invite genuine ruin. Sometimes the scandal that destroys you isn't a secret affair or a hidden crime. Sometimes it's simply too much gold, displayed too proudly, at exactly the wrong moment. Now comes the darkest turn in the story. For men whose entire identity was built on wealth and status, losing both could feel like losing the reason to go on. When a fortune collapsed and society turned its back, some ruined figures could not bear to face the whispers, the pity, and the silence. Their sudden fall sent shockwaves through the papers and left grieving families to carry both the loss and the shame. Beneath all that gold, these lives were far more fragile than they ever looked. For the men at the summit of your world, wealth and status weren't merely possessions, they were identity itself. A man of this era often defined himself entirely by his fortune, his standing, and the respect these commanded. They were who he was, the whole measure of his worth in his own eyes and the eyes of everyone he knew. This made such men powerful and proud, but it also made them dangerously brittle. When a person's entire sense of self rests on external things, the loss of those things can feel like the annihilation of the self, leaving nothing behind to hold on to, and in your world, those external things could vanish with terrible speed. When ruin came through a market panic, a failed scheme, an exposed scandal, a collapse of fortune and reputation together, it could therefore feel like the end of everything that mattered. The man who lost his wealth lost not merely his money, but his identity, his place in the world, and the respect that had sustained him. Worse still, he lost it publicly, in full view of a society that has once admired him and now turned away. The whispers began, the pity followed, and the doors that had always opened now quietly closed. For a proud man whose whole self was built on standing tall among his peers, this could be an unbearable weight. Some could not carry it. Faced with the wreckage of everything they'd been, the shame of a public fall, and the cold silence of a society that had abandoned them, certain ruined figures reached a point of despair from which they could see no way forward. The prospect of living on diminished and disgraced, of enduring the endless whispers and the averted eyes, felt impossible to bear. And so their stories ended in sudden tragedy, in falls that shocked the public and devastated those who loved them. These were dark endings to lives that had once blazed with wealth and promise, and they left a heavy silence behind. The families of these men were left to shoulder a double burden. There was the grief of losing someone, raw and real as any grief, and there was cruelly the shame that society attached to such a loss, the whispers that followed even into mourning. A grieving family might find itself carrying not only sorrow, but the weight of public judgment, struggling to preserve some dignity amid a tragedy the whole city was discussing. The very obsession with appearances that had shaped these lives extended even into their aftermath, denying the bereaved the simple decency of private grief. There's a profound and sobering truth in these darkest of endings. For all the marble and diamonds, for all the power and glory, these were human beings, as fragile beneath their gilded surfaces as anyone. The wealth that seemed to make them invincible could not protect them from despair, and in some ways made them more vulnerable by binding their entire worth to things that could be lost. Their tragedies remind us that the glittering world of your imagining was inhabited by real people who could suffer and break, and that a life built entirely on gold rests on a foundation more fragile than it appears. If you're carrying a weight like this yourself, please know it's worth reaching out to someone you trust. These lives mattered, and so does yours. Beneath every gilded surface, after all, beat a human heart. And so we reach the final chapter, the one waiting for everyone, no matter how many mansions they own. When a great figure of this world died, the funeral was another performance, vast, solemn, and impossibly expensive, complete with the tomb built to look eternal. But the fortunes faded, the ballrooms emptied, the famous names blurred into history, and the mighty families who terrified a nation became little more than portraits gathering dust. It turns out that all the gold in the world couldn't buy the one thing they craved most: to last. Even death in your world became an occasion for spectacle. When a great figure of society passed away, the funeral was staged with all the grandeur and expense that had marked their life, a vast solemn ceremony attended by the assembled elite, conducted with elaborate ritual and staggering cost. And beyond the funeral lay the tomb, often a magnificent structure of marble built to endure through the ages, a final monument to the family's wealth and standing. These were people who wished to be remembered forever, and they poured fortunes into securing that remembrance, raising eternal-looking edifices to guard their names against the erosion of time. But time, of course, is not so easily defeated, and the eternal monuments proved far less eternal than their builders hoped. The great fortunes that had seemed so permanent gradually faded, divided among heirs, eroded by extravagance, diminished by changing times and shifting economies. The mansions that had dazzled a nation were sold, demolished, or repurposed, their splendour scattered. The ballrooms where society had waged its glittering wars fell silent and empty. Piece by piece, the magnificent world these families had built dissolved, until little remained but memory and a few surviving stones. The famous names blurred too, which was perhaps the cruelest fate of all. The families who had once terrified a nation, whose approval could make or break a life, whose every move filled the newspapers, slowly faded from the public mind. New generations arose who neither knew nor cared about the old social wars, the fierce battles over opera boxes and calling cards and guest lists. The queens of society who had ruled with an iron pen became obscure figures in dusty histories, their once fearsome power reduced to footnotes. The very fame they had schemed and spent so desperately to secure proved as perishable as everything else. And so the mighty became portraits gathering dust, their faces preserved in oil paintings that hung, if they hung anywhere, in museums or storerooms where strangers passed without a second glance. The people who had commanded such attention in life became anonymous in death, their identities lost, their struggles forgotten, their triumphs meaningless to those who gazed upon them. All that frantic effort to matter, to rise, to be seen and remembered, dissolved at last into the same obscurity that swallows nearly everyone. The gilded world, for all its brilliance, could not exempt its inhabitants from the common fate of being forgotten. There's a quiet lesson in this final chapter, one worth carrying with you as you drift towards sleep. These families possessed almost unimaginable wealth and power, and they spent it chasing permanence of fortune, of status, of name. Yet permanence eluded them entirely, as it eludes us all. All the gold in the world could not purchase the one thing they craved most, which was to last, to endure, to escape the forgetting that comes for everyone in time. Their story, magnificent and tragic in equal measure, stands as a reminder that the things we grasp so tightly are more fragile than they seem, and that even the most gilded of dreams must, in the end, fade gently into history. And so, our long night in the Gilded Age comes gently to a close. You survived it. The marble palaces you couldn't quite afford to heat, the calling cards folded just so, the guest list that could erase a family overnight. You navigated the terror of the wrong fork, the cold shoulder of old money, the silent warfare waged with diamonds and Paris gowns. You endured a world where a husband's secrets were shrugged away and a wife's were fatal, where divorce meant exile and a single cut across a crowded ballroom could end everything you'd built. It's easy to envy them, those glittering families in their limestone castles, but tonight you saw the truth beneath the gold, the sleepless dread, the crushing performance, the fortunes that vanished before breakfast, the secrets locked in someone else's drawer. They had everything money could buy and almost none of the things it couldn't. Peace, safety, the simple freedom to be unremarkable and unafraid. They chased permanence with every ounce of their wealth, and permanence slipped through their fingers anyway, as it always does. So take a moment to honour them in all their splendour and all their folly. They were human beings, proud and fragile, doing their exhausting best in a world of impossible rules, and then let them rest, because tonight you get to do the one thing all their gold could never guarantee. You get to close your eyes without calculating anyone's rank. You get to sleep in a home that asks nothing of you, in a life that's yours alone, unwatched and unjudged. No guest list, no scandal sheet, no ballroom holding its breath. History may be gilded and grand and a little bit ridiculous, but it's also proof that the quiet, ordinary comforts you have right now are worth more than every diamond those families ever wore. Rest easy. You've earned it. Good night.